Hi, it's Karie and welcome to the first sew along of the new year. I'm so happy to be here with you today. We have a great project that is actually perfect for the beginning of the year because you can hang it up in January and leave it up all the way through December. We're going to walk through how to do this, so stay tuned as we make the 4 Seasons Welcome sign. So let's take a closer look at the 4 Seasons Welcome sign. This is actually created like a tiling scene, which I know you guys have watched us do a few times. So we're going to walk through that. It's nothing that is super complicated, which is great. It's an easy project, something quick to do or great for beginners. The way this is done is actually done in tiles. So you have the letters that are individual and they're done with applique. In this case, we used felt. We have an example with our Luxe Sparkle vinyl, which is so fun. And I'm going to show you that you can also do it just with your quilter's cotton fabric in a little bit. So the way this works is that you have all of the letters and then you have essentially a blank tile. So this one actually has Velcro already fused onto it, but you can kind of just see there's a little crosshair here, which we will stitch this block and I'll show you how that works. But the neat thing is you're going to fuse a piece of Velcro on and then you can change out the elements depending on the season. Of course, we included an O, so if you just wanted to say welcome and you don't have a specific season in mind, you can do that. And then we have all 4 of our seasons. So we have our flower for spring, our sunshine for summer, of course our little leaf for fall, and our snowflake for winter. So really great, leave it up, switch out the elements, and you'll have a wall hanging that will last you the whole year. So just like all of our projects, you are going to receive a PDF with full color step-by-step instructions with this collection. So we're going to walk through this together, but you can see that you'll have your thread list, supplies suggested, and we're going to go over why we chose the supplies that we suggest, what type of fabric is best for this, notions, all the pieces, the completed size. So you have all the information you could ever need right here in this PDF. You don't have to print it. It's easier for filming, of course, but you can view this on your computer if you have it next to you while you stitch. It's just a great resource. So you can see it talks about the layout here. So all 7 tiles and your elements. And then you have your general instructions. So you have your general instructions that tells you how many of each to make, if you needed to make more than one of a block, which designs have any special instructions. All of that stuff is here for you, so it's like we're with you in your sewing room as long as you follow the instructions. So the first thing we're going to do is get our applique fabric ready, and we're going to complete one block together. So I'll actually be using quilting cotton today for my example. We have, as you saw earlier, we have this example which has felt, which is a little bit thicker obviously than quilting cotton, and we also have our sparkle vinyl example here, which again is a little bit thicker. So for the quilting cotton, I need to stabilize it in some way before we applique, because if we don't, you can have a result that has kind of bubbles or ripples, and you might get some fraying around the edge when you trim it. So what I did is I cut my piece of quilter's cotton. I have some fun Tula fabric here, and I backed it with a piece of fusible woven. So fusible woven is a wonderful product that is an iron-on that will essentially up the thread count of your fabric. So it's a fabric prep. It's not really a stabilizer, but what it does is it makes your fabric a little bit beefier. That way, when you embroider on it, it will stand up a little bit better. And when you trim it, it will help the edges not fray. So we have our prepared piece of applique fabric here. So I'm going to set that aside. The instructions also will tell you, we have a technique that we call chain hooping. That's kind of a funny saying, but the thing that's great about it is it actually helps you save fabric. And if you're like me, I hate to waste fabric. So let's show you what that looks like in practice. I actually got a little bit of a head start here so I could show you how this works. But you can see, I think, it's a big one, essentially for chain hooping, what you do is you cut a piece of fabric that's the width of the fabric by the size of the hoop that you're going to use, right? So you can see that my fabric and my stabilizer are all in the hoop here. So I have my last letter to complete, but you can see that we embroidered one letter and then just scooted the fabric up and continued with all of the rest of them. Instead of having separate pieces cut, that reduces the waste in between your blocks. Something to remember, and we do mention this in the instructions, is you want to leave at least 1.5 inches between your blocks, and that's going to allow for the seam allowance that we're going to cut later. So the stabilizer we suggest for this project is actually heavyweight tearaway. And I know that might seem like a lot of stabilizer, but we actually tested medium weight and lightweight and all sorts of different things when we were preparing these instructions, and the heavyweight actually gave the nicest finished result. You can certainly do whatever you feel comfortable with at home. This worked best for us, and we always like to suggest the things that we know you will absolutely get the best results with. Remember, if you don't have heavyweight stabilizer at home, you can use 2 layers of medium weight or layer up a layer of lightweight and medium weight. You can combine weights to kind of get that stabilization that you need. So the layer that we have here is, let's get this. We have our cotton, and then we have that backed with fusible woven, and this is all outlined in the instructions. And then I actually used a spray adhesive just to temporarily tack it to our heavyweight tearaway. So I have kind of a nice long strip to work with, and again embroidered and moved down. So you can see here we're ready to do our last letter, and we've got it all hooped. The thing that is important about hooping this, as you can see, I have the fabric hooped. Sometimes people ask if they can cut smaller pieces, maybe something that's just a little bit bigger than the tile, and float it on a sticky stabilizer, and you certainly could. The problem is when you don't have your fabric secure in the hoop, when you embroider, there's a greater chance of it shrinking, the fabric kind of being drawn in with the stitches and creating ripples and bubbles around the edges. So we find that if you can hoop all of your layers for a tiling scene, you're going to get a better result. So I'm going to take this to the embroidery machine and embroider step 1 and show you what that looks like. Okay, so the first step is just a outline stitch. Let's get that tail out of there. So you can see it just stitched an outline of the letter, in this case the letter E. I think you should be able to see that on camera, but we used a nice dark thread for you. So then we take our prepared piece of applique fabric, and we're just going to make sure that we cover that outline fully. You can take some tape if you want, some tearaway tape, and tape this in place. I am going to be a little risky today and not tape it in place. So I'm going to stitch the next step, and I will show you that. All right, so step 2 is actually this tack down stitch. And something that's really cool that our digitizers have been doing for, I don't know, as long as I can remember, so almost 30 years, they make this double tack down stitch. And you can kind of see it here on camera where there's 2 lines of stitching. And that's because when we trim this applique, we want to trim nice and close. So if you cut through that first line, you still have a second line to help keep your fabric in place. So your applique fabric isn't going to pull up and then not get covered with your next step, which is a satin stitch, which would really be a bummer. So we're going to trim away the outside of this fabric. And again, you're going to want to get as close as you can, and don't worry about trimming that inside stitch, or outside stitch, I'm sorry. All right, so we've got that trimmed out. Let's get rid of these scraps. So now we're going to put this back on the machine, and we're going to stitch the next step, which is actually the satin stitch that's going to cover that applique. All right, so we stitched our satin stitch, and then we just went ahead and stitched this nice bean stitch that's around the outside. It's a little extra detail. So the very last step for this tile is actually what we call the seam stitch. And you can see it, I think, in these tiles before, and we will do this last step. And this is just going to show you exactly where to trim, so when you assemble this, it is perfectly put together. So an important step is going to be, and we do tell you this in the instructions, is to change your bobbin thread. The reason we tell you to do that is you're going to trim these blocks from the back. And you can see on some of these, I used a bright colored bobbin thread so that it's easier to see your line to trim from the back, because if it was white bobbin thread, it would be a little bit trickier to see. So I have a pink bobbin here. I'm going to change that, stitch my seam stitch, and then we'll be right back. All right, so we have our seam stitch here with our contrasting bobbin on the back. Now that we've embroidered all of our letters, we are going to stitch out the final tile, which is the empty tile that will Velcro the freestanding elements to. I ran out of room on my strip piece of fabric here. I probably could have squeezed them all in, but I didn't want to risk losing my seam allowance. So I just prepared the same layers of stabilizer and fusible woven. We're going to hoop that, and we'll stitch that final block. So that is the quickest block to embroider. You can see here all that's involved is the outline stitch and a crosshair. This is going to be the center of your block, and that's where you're going to put your Velcro when we get to that step. Of course, I have changed the bobbin thread like I did with the other tiles so that we could easily cut that out. So for the freestanding elements, there are 5 included in the collection. So again, we have our O and then all 4 of our seasons. I have some ideas about how to add more to this collection that I'll show you in a little bit, but let's walk through how to make one of these. We're actually going to make the sun together. So in our instructions, we include the templates to cut these appliques out. You certainly don't have to cut them out ahead of time. However, I find that it's easier in some cases. We'll talk about why. The instructions call for using stable stick cutaway as a backing for your fabric. So stable stick cutaway is a great stabilizer for in your hoop for when you are embroidering on harder to hoop items because it's got a sticky back. In this case, however, we're not using it as a stabilizer. So I've cut 2 pieces of stable stick cutaway. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is essentially this stabilizer just cut to the same size as my applique fabric. If you were making your applique elements out of felt or out of sparkle vinyl or fake leather or whatever it is, you might not need as much stabilization. But you want these elements to be rigid so that they hold up to putting on, taking off, and storage and all of those sorts of things. So I'm using a quilter's cotton to make my sun. So I need to give this some more stability. I have 2 options. I could use this stable stick, and if you were going to do that, you take your pieces and you actually just peel away the paper backing, revealing your sticky stabilizer. And you would place that on the back of your fabric. I use 2 layers, and then that will create sort of a more stiff fabric. However, because this is such a lightweight fabric compared to a felt or a sparkle vinyl, I'm actually going to use a product that we have called Fiberform. So Fiberform is a specialty product that we carry that adds rigidity to projects. So I have a piece cut here, and you can see that it stands pretty much on its own. So it's going to give whatever you put this into some nice stiffness. We use this a lot in freestanding structures to give that sort of architectural stability to those. But in this case, we are going to use it with our applique. So the way that I think it's easiest to do this is to actually pre-cut your Fiberform into the shape of your applique piece before you put it in the hoop. So the way I'm going to do that is I actually printed a template, one of our mirrored patterns. You can see I printed this here. You can kind of tell this is the shiny side of a piece of applique Fusion Fix. Applique Fusion Fix is a great product. It's 8.5 by 11, so it can run through your printer. And it is a fusible web that is perfect for situations like this. So we're actually going to cut this out, fuse it to our Fiberform, and then use that as a template to trim. So I've already printed this onto our piece of Fuse and Fix. You can see this side is sort of shiny. I'm not sure it really shows up on screen. And this side is papery. So the paper side is what we're printing on. So I'm going to roughly cut out our sun. All right, so we have our fiber form and our applique Fuse and Fix that we printed with the pattern. And then we're just going to use our iron kind of on medium-high heat and fuse that to the piece of fiber form. Now that we have that fused, we're going to trim it out just on this black line here. All right, so we've got that all trimmed. So we're going to set this aside, and now we're going to hoop our stabilizer to embroider our freestanding element. So I have a layer of Badge Master and a layer of Aquamesh. So these are both water-soluble stabilizers, which is what you need so that you have a freestanding element when you're done. It doesn't matter which layer is on top, but I'm going to hoop these two together. Now that that's hooped, I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to stitch our first step for our freestanding element, which is the placement stitch. All right, so we have stitched our first step, which is our placement stitch. Now this is in yellow, so it may be a little tough to see, but it has stitched, it's telling us exactly where to place our piece of fiber form. So I'm going to take my perfect scoring tool, which will help me remove the paper, the applique Fuse and Fix that we just fused. And now the applique Fuse and Fix has made the fiber form into a sticky sticker. So we're going to line that up with our placement stitch as best we can. So the reason I like to pre-cut fiber form is because it's so thick. And if we had to trim this in the hoop like we will our applique fabric in a moment, it's really difficult to get close enough. So I like to pre-cut this, and then I'll take our piece of applique fabric and cover up the entire thing. We're going to take this back to the machine, stitch our tack down stitch, and then I will be right back. All right, so it has now stitched that double tack down line, and we're going to trim away our applique fabric. All right, so we've done our trimming. Now we're going to bring this back to the machine and do the rest of our embroidery steps. Now something I didn't mention, but it's very important, is that for the last step of these applique elements, you want to change the bobbin thread to match the top thread. And that's because you're going to see the edge of this element and you want the top and bottom thread to match. So now you're going to trim the majority of the stabilizer away. So you're going to rinse this out in warm running water, and that will dissolve all of this water-soluble stabilizer. You're going to let that dry and then press it on a perfect embroidery press cloth. All right, so we are going to now trim all of our blocks to get ready for assembly. So the instructions will tell you that you're going to need to use this seam line, and we're going to cut a 1/2 inch away from that stitching line. Being accurate here is going to make it a lot easier to assemble when we get to that point. So we're going to do that for all of our tiles. So now I've got all of my tiles trimmed. Make sure you've spelled everything correctly. And then you're going to take that tile, the empty tile, and that will go in between. So now we're going to sew these together. And because we've cut this 1/2 inch seam allowance, when we line these up, we sew just inside this seam line, everything will be exactly where we want it to be. So I'm going to sew these together, and then we'll go on to the next step. All right, so I have all of my tiles sewn together. Now we need to press our seams open. Before we press, I'm going to remove the stabilizer that's in this seam allowance to make it easier to press this flat. Because it's a tearaway, it's easy to do. All right, now that we have all of the stabilizer removed from these seam allowances, we're going to press our seams open and flat. I like to use the Perfect Point and Press tool to keep my fingers out of the way of the steam. All right, so we have that all assembled. And now what you would do is you would create a sandwich with batting and backing if you wanted to. If you wanted to just use backing, you could do that. You can bind this like you would a quilt, or you can do a stitch and turn where you would put the backing face down, leave a space to turn, and turn that inside out. On our samples, you can see that we added a piece of ribbon for hanging loops. So you can do that. But let's pretend that this is all quilted. We did on this one. So on this one, we actually just did a little serpentine stitch. It's easier to see on the back. On this one, we just stitched in the ditch. So you could certainly do decorative quilting in the negative space, but I think that the design kind of has enough going on. So the very last step, if we pretend that this is sandwiched, is now we can see why it was important to have this crosshair. So what you're going to do is you're going to take Velcro. You can do a couple things. You can use fuse and seal and fuse it on. You can sew it on if you want before you create your quilt sandwich, or you can get Velcro that already has adhesive that is iron-on. So I have some iron-on Velcro here. So I would just cut a piece and iron it right on the center mark of that block. Now let's talk about some other things you can do with those freestanding elements. So here's the sun that we embroidered earlier. So we would flip this to the back and fuse a piece of Velcro onto that. And that's how. That looks pretty great. It's so fun to see it in bright colors. So that's how you would attach your freestanding elements. So I was thinking, we have the wonderful, the O that's included. If you wanted it to just say welcome, which I think is kind of fun. But what if you didn't want to do something that was a 4 seasons and you wanted to mix it up a little bit? So it occurred to me that any of our freestanding applique, or really applique designs, could be used to make your freestanding element here. So I took a butterfly from our Luminous Freestanding Butterfly collection and embroidered that. And so I could just apply Velcro to the back of this, and then you have a butterfly element, which I think is really fun. This one's a little bit small, but I think it works. This is a heart from our gradient heart patches. All right, put Velcro on the back of that, and now you have a heart as your element. So anything that we have on our site that has a satin stitch around the outside, you could create an element like this. So let your imagination go wild, and don't just feel stuck to be the 4 seasons. You can have hearts and butterflies. It's all very girly here. This makes me think of spring, which hopefully will be here soon. Makes me really happy. I hope you enjoyed making this along with me. I'd love to see your finished projects on the Perfect Stitch, which is our Facebook group. It was really fun to get to do this and to show you some different options for our 4 seasons welcome sign. So thank you for joining me. We will see you next time. Happy stitching!